Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. John, welcome for the first time. And then Steve and Kristin, welcome back. We're excited to have you back.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
glad to
It's
be
great to be
back.
back.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh my gosh. Well, we cannot wait to dig into complex text and comprehension more with you all today. I want to kick us off by sharing that you wrote an article that kind of inspired this conversation. It was titled Supporting Elementary School Students Reading of Difficult Texts. You wrote this in 2018, but the big ideas are still so important today. And one thing that stood out to me, I pulled a quote that said, "The support we provide can shift the level of texts the students can handle." That is so powerful. Like when and you kind of had this analogy of thinking about students' instructional level as elastic rather than fixed because it depends on the support they receive. So I think this kind of does debunk that idea, right, of our teacher training. I know I had this teacher training of matching texts to a student's instructional level and avoiding those frustration level texts. But with the right support, we do know that students can succeed with these more difficult texts. Melissa, I think you might have a question about these difficult texts, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I wanted to start. I think we're going to talk about like the students and the texts a lot today. So we're going to start by talking about the texts themselves and what makes text so difficult. But, you know, we've heard this phrase a lot, and most people probably have, of leveled texts lead to leveled lives. And there's been a lot of conversation. We've talked about it on the podcast about leveled texts. So can we just start with that idea of what's the difference between a leveled text and a complex text, and why might we want to lean more towards these complex texts versus the leveled texts?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I kind of just want to give a nod to other researchers in this space who have done this work before us and who influenced us in this article. I believe that leveled text leading to leveled lives quote, we know Dr. Al Tatum has used that quote. And then the notion of the instructional level sort of texts matched with students being more elastic. I think Kay Stahl had written about that as well, right? So there are lots of folks who are doing work in this space, and I just kind of wanted to start with the impetus for this article about supporting students in reading complex text, right? So we as teachers, former teachers ourselves, were trained to think carefully about how to match students with texts that would be at their level, that wouldn't be too frustrating for them, right? But which would enable them to grow. And then new sets of standards really kind of shifted the conversation to complex text for all students. I know in my classroom as a former English language arts teacher, it wasn't uncommon to use sort of quote unquote below grade level texts with students because maybe their reading proficiencies weren't matched with the grade level expectations, right? And so we've had similar experiences, and I know Steve and Kristin will talk about theirs as well. But so what we really wanted to do was look into what supports teachers could provide to help students read those complex texts. And really, before we got into this article itself, Steve and Kristin with Dr. Freddie Hebert conducted a literature review investigating the relationship between text difficulty and reading achievement. So basically what would happen to students' reading achievement in terms of fluency and comprehension if you increase the text difficulty that they're exposed to. So I think it's important that we talk about that piece first here, and maybe Steve and Kristin could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little history behind that review piece that we did. Kristin and I were both working at NC State at the time, working together, and we were in a big audience in a talk being given by Tim Shanahan, and it was pretty soon after the Common Core standards had come out with the guidance for working in complex text. And Tim started talking in his talk, as he has across the years since then, with his argument about why instructional level matching was not an effective way to support students' literacy development. And Chris and I were sitting next to each other, and we both looked at each other and we were like, no way, like this cannot possibly be true. We were both trained in, like you said, Gloria, in the instructional level matching kind of format. And so we started at the time, he was citing some studies in his talk. We start Googling these studies as we're sitting there in the audience. And that through those discussions, like between Kristin and I, we got to this point where like, what does the evidence actually say about working in complex text? And so that sort of got us embarked on this piece that we ended up writing with Freddie, and really looked into what happened for students, especially in elementary grades, but especially in grades 2 through 5. And we can talk a little bit about some of the main findings that happened there, but I think that one of the things that I want to highlight before I get into the findings is that the articles that we looked at were generally articles where students were put into different levels of text to see what happened to the fluency and comprehension outcomes. But by and large, these were studies where the level of support for students was not also being adjusted to help them be successful in more complex text. So some of the things in the article that John was referencing about really supporting students in complex text, those weren't happening in our review. We were just looking at what happens to students' fluency, what happens to their comprehension when they get into more complex text. And what we found was probably not unexpected for most people. The more difficult, more challenging, more complex the text is, students' fluency tends to decrease, and it's especially so for less skilled and beginning readers. And a similar relationship was found for comprehension, where the more complex the text was, the less comprehension students tended to show, especially for students who are less skilled and beginning readers. Kristin, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you got it. I just think it speaks to our shock back in 2012 or whenever we first heard Shanahan kind of did lead to that article, which then led to this reading teacher article. But I think it parallels the shock many teachers have as they're being confronted with this shift as well. So.
Right. So, I mean, to get back to your original question as well about, why complex text and not level text. So once Steve and Kristin and Freddie had written this piece, and I remember Steve and Kristin had come to me and said, well, we want to write something for the reading teacher that teachers how could they use this information, right? And so we summarized those findings and thought, okay, well, if we increase text difficulty, student achievement, in terms of fluency and comprehension might decline, but what can teachers actually do about that, right? So we turned to some additional research, including practitioner-focused articles and recommendations, looking at, what really are the benefits of complex text. One of the things that we wrote about, and that was, interesting to us, was that, complex texts can be motivating, right? So persevering through a challenging task with support to be successful in that task can be a motivating experience, right? And then, of course, there are a host of other benefits of reading complex text. We wrote this article, I would say, a little bit before the current emphasis on knowledge building approaches to comprehension. I mean, it was happening, right? But so we didn't get too much into that. But of course, reading more challenging texts can be useful for building knowledge, for building comprehension, for building fluency with progressively more difficult texts, right? So there's lots of benefits for using complex texts. But I think the fear is that if we just put complex texts in front of students without providing them with enough support, what's going to happen is that they're not going to have those successful experiences, right? And we want to ensure that they have that. So really the way that we set up this piece was around 3 main recommendations for teachers to consider. So one is to consider the text difficulty, look really closely at the text that you're using, what makes a text more difficult than another text. Number 2, look really closely at your readers' skills, right? Assessments that you have of student skills. Remember Steve's point from their piece that for beginning readers and less skilled readers, the detriments might be more pronounced. So we want to be careful about that, and also think about based on our students' assessed needs, how can we then provide supports, right, to meet those needs, basically to bring all students up to reading challenging, complex grade level text with appropriate supports.
John, I'm wondering, or anyone can address this, but can you talk about that motivation again really quickly? Because my first thought is if you give a student a book that's too hard, right, that it's at their frustration level, and that will decrease their motivation to want to read it. They'll want to give up on it. So can you just talk about, you said that was research that showed that there was motivation for these complex texts. Can you talk about that?
Kristin, do you want to take this question?
So, first of all, I'm right now analyzing all this data where we interviewed second, third, fourth, fifth graders about reading preferences. So I'm kind of knee deep in spending time with kids talking about reading. Not one of them ever talked about text difficulty when they talked about the books, right? They're talking Wings of Fire, Dogman, graphic novels, whatever, but they're never saying, oh, I look forward to pulling out book on X level. Like, that's not part of it. What draws kids to text are the topics, the plot, those kinds of things. So on a side note, we just know kids care about books based on what's in them. There was a dissertation study done now probably 2 decades ago, Juliette Halliday, where she explored sort of what happens when you give kids texts that are interesting to them to sort of see if they're difficult, but kids wanted to read them. And she found that kind of that interest trumped what traditionally people would say, no, this book's too hard for you. And that makes sense, right? Like, if I really want to read about snakes, even though there's all this new vocabulary and I don't know much about it, but I'm motivated to read it, I'm willing to persist even as it gets difficult. Now, current research on motivation is really highlighting the role of competence beliefs. And that's going to fall on the teacher to really provide the support. So when a student has it, they have the belief that they will be able to be successful with it. And so that's part of motivation. I would say that's really where a lot of the research is out now, to kind of think about what kind of language frames and scaffolds can teachers provide so that students don't look at it and go, oh, this is going to be too challenging for me. Because we all know kids aren't going to say, you know, Miss Conradi, I can't read this book because it's too hard for me. They're going to say this is stupid, right? And so we have to figure out how do we navigate that? Does that kind of answer it? Okay.
Totally. Or they need to go to the nurse for something, right?
Or the bathroom for 20 minutes. I also think, we didn't say this, but I just thought, you know, teachers listening might be wondering, I kind of want to think about what leveled means, right? Independent instructional frustration. Are we talking about when we say difficult text, are we talking in the frustration level? Are we talking about a continuum between instructional and frustration? I just kind of want to define that for those listening.
I'm happy to kind of tackle it. In the article, we address the difference between text complexity and text difficulty. And so text complexity is based on things like, you know, quantitative measures like a lexile measure, or some qualitative measures that can make a specific text just complex. Maybe it uses an unusual register or a lot of difficult vocabulary or figurative language or different things that can make a text complex. Text difficulty, on the other hand, that's when we think about sort of the match between a reader and a text. So even a Dogman book could be difficult for a 5-year-old, right? Because that kid's not quite there yet. And so we tried to sort of parse apart text complexity versus text difficulty, because even, you know, I have a PhD in reading, but there are still texts that are going to be very complex and will present difficulty for me. And that's the same, of course, with our children. So we're not really getting at kind of the BETS, instructional, frustration, independent level kind of stuff. But we were really trying to parse out the difficulty level there. I don't know if that is
No, that's
enough?
really helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, because I keep thinking, you know, that is a question that Melissa and I get a lot about the different kinds of levels. And to me, when we get those questions, it's like, well, there's also like, it's not just about like the text level, it's about the reader too. And what we're, and I, like you all said, like all those invisible things, right? The motivation and the ability to persist if they're super interested in the topic, or maybe they have some knowledge on it and they want to learn more. So there's just so many other factors that go into it. I like the idea of being able to parse those out, like complex and difficult.
And I think it falls on the teacher then to be the broker in that experience, right? Because the teacher's the one who knows their students. They know which students might sort of need extra support in background knowledge building in order to access that text. They know which students for whom even just fluency might be difficult. But the teacher's the one who knows, you know, needs to know the text well to be able to kind of size that up, but also knows their students.
Yeah.
And can I just add, you know, I think it's one of the challenges that we face in the field is the terminology around text complexity. And so, like, to build on what Kristin just said, we've suggested in our article that text complexity is about the text, right? It's about those factors that Kristin was talking about, right? Conceptual difficulty, right? Vocabulary, those sorts of things. Text difficulty is about a text relation to a reader. But the other thing that comes into play here, I think, is at some point over the last few years with the Common Core, texts that are at grade level are now have become synonymous with complex text. And so sometimes the grade level text and complex text are sort of interchanged. And so I think that's an important distinction to remember too, right? That there are texts that are at grade levels for particular students or whatever, but there are also texts that could be well above the grade level that students could be reading. And so those are somewhat different. And I think it's important, I think it would be really great, especially to help teachers, if we could come to some agreement around the vocabulary and the labels for these texts to make the conversations easier to have.
I love that. And we're guilty of that too. So thank you for that reset. We're going to make sure we're doing better on that spectrum, or labeling, I should say. All right. So if we can kind of dig into this idea of text complexity, because I know teachers are out there thinking, okay, if I'm hearing a lot about lexile levels, but I know that's not the only thing to look at, what else do I need to consider? So I'll hand it over to you all to tell us a little bit more about what's likely to be difficult about texts for students or a specific text.
I can start, but feel free, John or Steve, to jump in. So the Common Core did some of this work for us because they outlined kind of what they were calling the qualitative sort of areas of difficulty. And I addressed it a little bit earlier, but really sort of, is the meaning of the text, the purpose of the text, is that pretty straightforward? Or is that something that the reader's going to kind of have to figure out on their own? Is that straightforward? So that's one part of it, the structure of the text, the language conventionality and clarity, and then, of course, these knowledge demands. What we know about teachers and research with teachers around difficult texts is that teachers tend to zero in on vocabulary. It's like, if you ask a teacher to look at a text and go, what's hard here? They just go and they start pointing to like 11 different vocabulary words. But there really is a lot more at play. And I look back at when I was teaching second or fourth grade, and I wasn't particularly good at kind of sizing up the text and seeing like, oh, there are no sort of subheaders here that are going to guide the reader, or this text employs a lot of flashbacks that might confuse a reader, or a lot of different characters. So there's so many different things that could lead to some difficulty for a student. So I don't know, John or Steve, if you want to add any more.
Yeah, I think you've summed it up pretty well, Kristin. Right, in the Common Core points us to that, and in the piece we kind of included some maps that teachers could use, or to kind of plan out and think about these challenging aspects of text. One piece that I just want to highlight, I've done a lot of work related to the text structure, right, and supporting students' reading of challenging text through making the text structure clear, right, and more explicit for them. So that's a piece where I think it's useful for teachers when using a text that might be difficult for their students to think about, well, how are the ideas in this piece structurally related to one another, and how can I make that clear to students? And that can help drive comprehension as well.
All right, so I think we should start to talk about the hard question of what teachers can do when they're in this situation where, and this happens all the time, right? Where you have a fourth grade level text, right, Steve? I'm going to use your terms there. It's the grade level text, which might be complex for that grade level, and that's why it was chosen for whoever chose it, the curriculum or the school or the teacher chose that book for the fifth grade and then or fourth grade. And then you have all your students at different places, right? So you have some students that might not even be that difficult of a text. Others, it might be like right where they need to be. And for others, it might be really difficult. And I really want to talk about, that's the hardest part, is when it's a really difficult text for students. How do we help them? What do we do? You mentioned scaffolds a few times. How do we scaffold and support students to read that difficult text instead of saying they can't read that, let me give them a different text that they can read. What can we actually do? And I'm going to just throw in another thing. What are things that might not actually be that helpful that teachers think are like, I'm just trying to get them to get through this book, but it might not be the most helpful?
Yeah, I think we're going to share three main recommendations, and I'll start with the first one. And I'll get to the second part of your question first. So when we look at observational research in classrooms, both with print text and digital text, what we see is that one of the main ways that teachers will try to support their students' reading of grade level complex text is they'll either read aloud the text for students, or if it's a digital text, they'll employ kind of read aloud functions, right? Well, the text can read that for them. And I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I'm not trying to say that read-alouds, interactive read-alouds in the way that we conceptualize them aren't important. They certainly are for building listening comprehension and background knowledge and vocabulary and language knowledge and all sorts of things, right? But if we are consistently reading aloud text to students instead of giving them the opportunities to read the text with support, then we're perhaps not building their reading comprehension skills, right, to the extent that we are hoping to do so. So building on that idea of interactive read-alouds and other texts, our first recommendation is really to think about how texts are presented in sets of related texts, right? So that perhaps teachers and students work their way up to challenging grade level texts by reading easier texts on the same topic and then working their way up to more difficult texts, or even beginning with an interactive read aloud of a text on the same topic where they can be exposed to some of the vocabulary and knowledge that they will then see in the text. And so lots of folks have done work in this area, I'll say as well. Gina Cervetti's work on conceptually coherent text sets, as well as the work on quad text sets that Bill Lewis and Sharon Walpole and Mike McKenna had started, really point to the benefits of approaching text from a sets of related text approach instead of thinking about, well, I have this one difficult text in isolation. What am I going to do about this? Well, let's think about that in relation to the other text that students experience.
So I can jump in with a second idea here, and related to your question, Melissa, about sort of you have this wide range of student abilities in your classroom. I think another thing that can be really helpful for teachers is to have profiles of their students that are based on the assessment data that they have to really help them think about what types of scaffolds and supports are going to be most helpful to different groups of students in their classrooms. And so I think being able to have a really high quality set of assessments that can help identify students in your classroom who may have difficulties with word recognition and fluency still, or maybe some comprehension difficulties with more challenging and difficult text, and students who might be multilingual learners. And so they may not have the English background. They may have it in their home language. And so thinking about how to really support students that fit that profile would be another important thing that teachers could focus on. That really helps identify which scaffolds might work best for which groups of students. And I say that, but I also say it with a caution that that only works as well as the sort of like the quality of the set of assessments that you have. So if you don't have a set of assessments as a teacher that can really help you pinpoint like what the particular strengths are of readers and what their particular needs are, so that you can really address scaffolds to those particular needs, I think it can be really challenging. I know in a lot of the work that we've done here in Delaware and in working with our Department of Education, one of the frustrations that we often run into is where people may have a screener that they use with all the students in their classroom, and anyone who shows up as below benchmark is sort of getting the same scaffolds to support them, right? So these are my kids who are quote unquote struggling. They're all going to get this extra thing. And hopefully it's not like John said, they always have the text read to them or something like that. And so I do think like knowing that you have a really strong set of assessments where you have screeners, but you also have diagnostic assessments that can really help pinpoint student strengths and area of needs, that can be so helpful for teachers to then think about what are the most appropriate scaffolds to use with different profiles of readers in my classroom.
And then I just want to add on, and I don't think we've said it yet, so I want to make sure we sort of really hit it home. None of this sort of should happen in the absence of also really good code-based instruction, right? Like we're assuming for our kids in 4th grade who are really struggling still, we're assuming that sort of as part of this conversation, they're getting really good phonics fluency support and instruction. So I just wanted to make sure I said that. But a third kind of recommendation that we'd make is we want to think about, so if we're really talking about instead of differentiating the instructional level, instead differentiating the support, like Steve said, we need to know our readers, and then we have to be kind of mindful of thinking about how do we differentiate that support? When and where and how can I make sure all of my students will be successful with whatever text, whether it is if you have the luxury of doing a novel in your 4th grade classroom, or whether you're doing sort of a core reading program, there are going to be students that need support. And some of the supports are already embedded if you do have a core reading program, but you're still going to have to be the one to kind of navigate and decide how to kind of support your students. We've been influenced a lot by Walpole and McKenna and their bookworms model of differentiating at the skill level rather than kind of instructional level. And so as you look at your school data and you look at your students and go, hey, I have some students who still are going to need some maybe small group time or extended learning time where we're working on code-based things, but maybe I have some other students who we're about to tackle a text that's set in the future and has robots, and I have some students who I don't think quite have the knowledge that would be helpful for them to sort of understand that text. Maybe on Thursday and Friday this week, I'm going to pull that group of students to the side and I'm going to have them read with me an easier text about robots so that they have some exposure to it beforehand. So some of this comes down to teachers being aware of what scaffolds are available and then knowing when and how and in what context they can provide them. And of course, we still love the before, during, after kind of format, but there are certainly things you can do before you read a text to sort of make sure students will be successful. Vocabulary, background knowledge, text structure, and I really think setting a purpose for reading, because it's not just about, hey, we're going to start reading now, right? Like, well, let's set that purpose. And then during reading, there's a lot of research to show the benefits of partnering students up. I know you had Jake Downs on, and so partnering students up where one of the readers might be a little bit more skilled than the other, and that'll support them as they read more complex texts. And then we can't sort of sleep on the importance of discussion and writing and thinking about the text afterwards.
Kristin, I'm just wondering about one thing you mentioned, because I was guilty of this for many years, where I would give an assessment that was based on my standards, and then I would get it back and I would say, okay, well, this student got this question wrong about theme. So then we would do a little small group about theme. And that is not what you're saying.
No,
right?
no.
Because I know I didn't do what I needed to do then.
Yeah.
But can you talk about how that's different from what you're saying about these skills?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And I think our constrained skills data, our data about sort of everything from letter awareness, letter sounds through fluency are very reliable. And it's easy for me to look at that data and then go, I need to support my kids in these things. Our data about the top of the rope, the unconstrained skills, are not going to be as helpful for us. And it's certainly not very beneficial to lump kids in groups like they got 6 out of 10 on inferring, and so I need to infer more with them. We know that kids don't transfer and apply it in the same way. And so I would say if you have students who have shown proficiency in fluency, but sometimes look up at you after they've read and they go, I have no idea what I just read, then we might want to do more things like chunking up the text, like the scaffolds that I encourage teachers to do, or things like paragraph shrinking or getting the gist. They have to be, I don't want to say trained in, but they have to learn the practices that we all as proficient readers do anyway. And so I would move more in the practices of comprehension and of thinking while reading, and less of let me parse this up into sub skills, which I did. So 20 years ago, if you went into my classroom, that was me. But does that answer it?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
I just want to add on to what Kristen said when she referenced the top of the rope, which I thought was a great comment. And because actually I had the same thing running through my head at this when she mentioned that. And I think so many teachers now have been trained in the science of reading and have gotten exposure to the reading rope if they haven't been already. But I think one of the things that we don't often discuss about the rope is what's those five components in language comprehension are all important, but what's really important is how they weave together over time for students to become increasingly strategic, as it says on the label on the rope. And I think that's the key part. So in your example, Melissa, and I did the same thing when I was teaching, right? We had standards. We wanted to make sure that we addressed those standards based on the assessments. But what often happens is the important part is how those standards are actually integrated and woven together for students to become skilled readers. And so to Kristen's point, I think that's the really important part that we see in the top half of that rope is that sort of development over time as students can integrate these in different texts for different purposes, right? And that's the thing that really matters.
And again, you go, John.
I just want to add one more piece here, because Kristen made the point about, kind of all the way from letters to fluency, right? So to make this kind of really practical and actionable for teachers, right? Thinking about code-based assessments, beginning, middle, and end of year benchmarks or any progress monitoring in between that's done around students' word recognition and decoding skills, their oral reading fluency. Look and see where students are performing in relation to grade level benchmarks in time of year, right? And that's a good starting point for thinking about, well, these students might need more fluency support, but they don't need more word recognition support based on the data that I have, right? These students are performing at or above benchmark in fluency, so maybe they don't need as much fluency support with this text, so that we're all approaching the same difficult text, but some students might need more word level support, some students might need more fluency support, some students might just need those comprehension supports, and then there might be mixing and matching across those, right? So I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about differentiating the instructional supports from supporting the code-based skills that they need, right, to attack the text. And I'm going to probably assume that if I'm using a difficult text that I'm going to provide comprehension supports for all students, but again, maybe different supports for different students based on what they're bringing to the text reading experience.
Yeah, John, actually, I was thinking about the same thing. And one thing that ran through my mind, I'm so glad that we're talking about this too, because I think it's like the trickiest of all of them, the most nebulous, right? Like differentiate supports. Okay, well, I'm a third year teacher. What does that actually mean? Like, how do I get in my kids' heads? So I love these practical examples and ideas. One thing I was thinking was something like very practical, like an anticipation guide, right? I could give that to all of my students, but then I could pull the ones who really just have no idea about this particular set of knowledge or vocabulary or information. Kristen, you gave that robot example, like thinking about going to the future. If they have no concept of what time travel might be, or robots, or any kind of information about any of those topics, they're going to be lost reading that particular text. And once we can scaffold and give them, I think we're now going back to the first recommendation, maybe some scaffolded text sets that include some knowledge and vocabulary to help them build up to what we're asking them to do. And then I'm just kind of putting it all together, right? Based on, again, their little profile based on what we've learned about them. Then we can kind of build it all together. It's not neat. It's not clean. It's kind of messy. And I think that's what's tricky about the whole thing is it's not like a check. Now they know about robots, so they can go ahead and read this text effectively, So I just wanted to throw that out there. I appreciate the depth of this conversation going very practically. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Can I add to that? I mean, the beauty of this, right, is now we're getting to encourage teachers to pick texts that they want to read, texts that relate to other texts that are on topics that they want to sort of read about. And it's not just what I did where it's like, oh, we need a level R or whatever sort of I was going for. And all of this just makes sense. For just an anecdote, my husband's really into science fiction. And sometimes he convinces me to watch a science fiction movie with him. And I know I'm going to be lost. I don't even want to read it. But what do? As I go to IMDb and read the plot first, right? I do that so that I'm not lost while we're watching the movie. And these are the kinds of, that's a little scaffold I've sort of developed in myself to make sure I won't sort of be unsuccessful watching the movie. And that's what we're talking about with some of our students, right? That's a tiny little scaffold to go, hey, we're going to read this thing. This was set in World War II. Some of you have varying knowledge of that. And I'm going to decide whether it's a whole class read aloud or whether I pull a group of students here or whether I tell all of you just in a few minutes what you need to know so that like you're not lost already in page 1 or page 2 and again kind of shut down. And so we're trying to think through how can we support readers through that. Anyway.
I just want to respond to that and build a little bit on what you said, Lori, about the anticipation guide as well, right? Because when we're thinking about knowledge and supporting that before, during, and after reading a text, I think an important distinction to make is, well, where do I need to build specific perhaps content knowledge that the text expects readers are bringing? Where is the text itself going to build knowledge? And where can I activate prior knowledge that students already have, right? So I make that distinction between the building versus activation of knowledge. And I think we're perhaps doing a disservice to our kids if we're always assuming, well, I need to build knowledge here because they're not going to know this. Well, different students are bringing different experiences and knowledge and topics that they're interested in into the classroom. And, teachers will know this, right? By the students really interested in this one particular topic and knows everything about it, and maybe the others don't. But so I think that's an important way of scaffolding and differentiating, right? Is where can I, activate some prior knowledge and build on that versus, build knowledge about a topic that some students might not have.
Yes, so helpful. Okay, so this is a little follow-up question to the one Melissa asked a while back. But I'm thinking about our teachers in K2. And, students are still learning to decode. And I know we had our caveat, right, that we're thinking about this idea in context of students having this really good structured instruction. But if we could kind of just like maybe backtrack to our K2 students, does this look any different in those grades? And I'm specifically thinking about maybe decodable texts. Is there to me, there's a different purpose for those. So I just want to make sure that we briefly chat about that.
Yes, I think that's a hugely important topic, especially when we're talking about text complexity and using complex text, because, Tim Shanahan in his argument, and he has a new book coming out around this, but one of the things that he talks about is that we have to exempt K1 from the sort of discussions around text complexity that are appropriate for grades 2 through 12. And because of exactly what you said, Lori, right? We have students who are still learning the basics, the foundational skills around reading. And so I do think that we have to think about K1. I'm going to limit it from K2 to K1 slightly differently. And I guess I would sort of boil it down to saying that we don't want students' initial experiences with learning how to read to be in something that is complex and really difficult and really challenging. We want them to be able to practice the foundational skills that they're learning in a way that's sort of helpful and sort of, for lack of a better way to say it, at a really great level. And so like your example for decodable text, I think is a great one. One of the things that we're hearing in some of the research is that decodable texts are often being used for too long of a period of time, and that they're really appropriate for that point in time when students are really learning about the alphabetic principle, they're really learning about blending and segmenting and, decoding. And so practicing those skills with appropriate decodable texts that are matched is the ideal time for those things to happen, but not beyond that, right? Then we want to start to move students into some types of easy readers, things that may have controlled vocabulary where they can also practice some of the other beginning reading skills as well. And so I think decodable texts are really important, but they're important for a particular period of time and a particular purpose as students are learning to read in those early grades.
And I would imagine, bringing it back to the read-alouds that John brought up earlier, that that's the place where our K1 students are hearing these complex texts is through the teacher read-alouds.
Absolutely. Just like John said, that is the ideal time for the read alouds that are clearly above sort of the K and one level, where teachers are reading those, they're introducing new vocabulary, different language structures, right? They're modeling strategies for comprehending, engaging students in lots of discussion, oral language development. All of those things can happen in really effective interactive read alouds in the early grades.
All right. So this article came out about 8 years ago, if you all can believe it's been that long. But you told us you've continued to do research on this topic. So we're just so curious about what you've learned since you wrote this article. So please, we'd love to hear whoever wants to start sharing what you've learned since.
Yeah, I'll start with some of the work that I've done since then, right? 8 years ago when this article came out, I was a doctoral student at University of Delaware working with Steve, and now I'm about to be an associate professor at University of Buffalo. So it's been about that long. And in the time since, I've been working mostly in the upper elementary grades, but now into the middle grades and high school as well, with an intervention called Read, Stop, Write that I initially designed to focus on supporting students' informational text reading through text structure and learning how to identify and use text structures both when reading informational text and then when writing their own informational text in response to in response to the informational text that they were reading, right? And what I was really trying to counter was something that I had mentioned earlier, which was seeing a lot of teachers using informational text passages and reading them aloud to students and then giving them kind of comprehension questions afterwards. But instead, how could I build out some supports focused initially on text structure for students to comprehend and write about those texts? And so that was actually my doctoral dissertation. I developed and I tested a version of Read, Stop, Write in 4th and 5th grades. And I found positive impact of this type of instruction on students' comprehension and writing skills. But with those experiences with teachers and talking to them in that study, teachers were still concerned with, like Kristin had mentioned earlier, the vocabulary that was in the text, right? And the words, the specific word recognition needs of those texts, as well as fluency support, right? So for the past few years, with support from the Reading Reimagined program, I've been developing a new version of Read, Stop, Write with my colleagues Laura Tortorelli and Blythe Anderson, which builds out multisyllabic decoding, vocabulary, and fluency supports into the Read, Stop, Write instructional model. And we just wrote about that in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. So there's an open access article on that program. But really, my work in this space now in grades 4 through 9 is to, again, provide all students with opportunities to read complex grade level informational texts about science and social studies topics, and then differentiating the instructional supports that teachers use and that students benefit from to read that text with some multisyllabic decoding strategies that are immediately connected to vocabulary, right? Because it supports a more robust word learning, right? Not just decoding the word, but also attaching it to a known word in memory or discerning the meaning of the text from the context, as well as including fluency supports through repeated reading in this lesson structure that we've developed, and still really focusing on text structure. And comprehension strategies like getting the gist, like paragraph shrinking, where students pause, reading with partners, pause, identify main ideas and important details in the text, and then summarize those, think about how they're structurally related, organize those in a graphic organizer to support text structure, and then plan and write their own informative writing to support their comprehension and build their writing of the text. So that's really the work that I've been doing, is thinking about how we can implement this type of instruction from upper elementary through high school grades. And it's really aligned also with the one of the most recent IAS practice guides on which Sharon Vaughn was first author, providing interventions for students in grades 4 through 9, right? So in that practice guide, from her research and lots of other folks' research, supporting students in what they call now stretch texts. So to throw out another term for you there, right? Texts that are going to be challenging for students, and especially building their multisyllabic decoding skills, their comprehension skills, and their fluency in order to comprehend those texts. So that's really the work that I've been doing for a number of years, and that I hope folks are interested in checking out.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say I was on John's doctoral committee, and it is great work. So I do hope people are interested in checking it out. And then I would say, the most recent work that I've been engaged in is actually with Kristin, and we have a chapter that's coming out in the Handbook on the Science of Literacy in grades 3 through 8, and our chapter is on text complexity. And so, I would just highlight, we sort of talk about some of the things that we've already talked about today, sort of being able to operationalize and sort of define text complexity, text difficulty, so on. We also do a review of sort of what is known about text complexity, especially focusing on the years since we wrote our original review on text complexity. And then we also, I think, talk quite a bit in the second half of the chapter about what kinds of things can we do in the field. So especially for teachers, what kind of things can happen? And, I just highlight a couple of things that we talk about in there. One of the things that we talk about is helping teachers to build a deep knowledge of text complexity. So helping understand the different sort of variables that go into text complexity, what makes a particular text complex, not only things like vocabulary, as John mentioned several times and Kristin mentioned, but also things like sentence structure, organization, language conventions, knowledge demands, all those sorts of things that play into complexity and difficulty. The other things that we talk about, as Kristin mentioned, were making sure to address foundational skills that students may need. So if students are struggling with word reading or fluency, we have to make sure that we're providing supports for that, addressing things like morphology and morphological knowledge to really support students' abilities to be successful with difficult and complex text. We also talk about different types of supports that teachers can incorporate. So we talk about supports for fluency, things like partner reading, as we've mentioned, also repeated reading. And, as Kristin mentioned, we've taken a lot of the work that we've done from the work that Sharon Walpole and Mike McKenna did on bookworms, and they even incorporate repeated reading into their shared reading block so that students are reading new text each day, but they're reading it once as a group and then a second time with a partner. So they're building in both the partner reading and repeated reading. And then we also know about structured programs like Stahl and Kuhn had with FORI, fluency-oriented reading instruction, as well as there's a variation of that called wide FORI, where students are reading multiple texts within the week. We also talk a little bit about multi-component supports. So being able to integrate and combine some of these different scaffolds and supports. So making sure we have like vocabulary supports as well as text structure analysis. That plays into something like the shared reading block in bookworms, like we've mentioned, but also in John's work around read, stop, write is also a type of multi-component intervention that really builds the integration of those scaffolds and those skills in for students. And we also reference John's new term there, the stretch text that Vaughn and colleagues talk about as well.
Oh my gosh, so much good stuff. Kristin, I'll let you add, but I do want to jump in and say it's all in the show notes. We're going to link the book to one. So we'll get all that information, but it's all in there. The intervention's linked. So if you're like, I want to see what this is, go to the show notes, click on it. Go ahead, Kristin.
The only thing I was going to add to that is that most of my energy has been on sort of translating research for teachers since 2018, but I do research in reading motivation, and I'm currently doing a big review, and I alluded to it earlier, but this notion of competence beliefs and how we can, not convince, but how we can sort of provide the support and create the conditions where students then think they can be successful. I'm really excited to sort of see what research is out there and try to kind of synthesize it for the field, because there really are certain language frames teachers can do and certain supports to ensure that students will be successful. So I also have an article out in the issue that John mentioned, the JAL article about motivation as it relates to adolescence, and specifically as adolescents encounter texts that are difficult. So I'll make sure to share that as well.
I just want to say one more piece since the book was mentioned on the science of literacy in grades 3 through 8. Sharon Walpole and I wrote a chapter on professional learning for that book as well. And so, when Steve and Kristin are talking about all these sorts of professional learning, right, that we hope to build in our teachers, to consider also the ways in which we approach professional learning for teachers to be effective for them, right? So it's not just kind of like the sit and deliver or perhaps some other approaches that we're seeing for professional learning. So we really actually dug into the science of professional learning for that chapter. And so I won't say too much about it here, but if you're already checking out the book, I think that chapter would be of interest as well.
Cool. That's awesome. We'll link it all. You all are just so busy. I don't know how you even had time to podcast with us today. Thank you. This is awesome. I feel so much more informed about all of this. And I'm just so grateful that you all took the time to talk with us. Like 8 years after, it's like we come knocking on your door. Hey, we really want to talk about this topic. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolute delight, as always.
Yep, as always, a lot of fun. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. There.